SpaceX was busy this week as usual, building new Starships, boosters, and their new launch pad. At the same time, all of the necessary pre-flight engine testing for both halves of the Flight 8 stack has been completed. And in case you missed it, one of those static fire tests was truly spectacular. Howdy, Tank Watchers. I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Let's start off with an update on Starbase's second launch pad, Pad B. This means we'll be jumping from the Sanchez lot, where the launch mount, flame diverter, QD arm, and a bunch of other stuff are currently being worked on, to the launch site itself. Progress on Pad B's launch mount continues as crews lift what look like covers for something into the interior ring of the mount. So far, only one side of the mount has received the water manifold attachments for the water-cooled flame deck, and only a single tube manifold has been installed on the side of the mount. It'll be pretty interesting to see if SpaceX only has one side hooked up for the water-cooled steel deck. I mean, what is it, just gonna spray out the other side? Only time will tell. Maybe they'll just hook up the other side. I don't know. Next to where the mount is being constructed is the flame deflector for Pad B, which every day gets more piping installed and looks a little more complete. Once crews have lined up all the pipes, they'll be welded with a bead going all the way down between each pipe. Once this is completed, this beefy thing will be rolled down Highway 4 to the launch site before being lifted into the flame trench. Speaking of the flame trench, and moving over here to Pad B at the launch site, we can see crews starting to install steel for a gantry that's being built on the south side of the flame trench and opposite of the tower. One theory is that this could be for the booster quick disconnect, the all-important interface between the rocket and the ground systems and tank farm, at least the first stage. The reason this theory has been going around is that nothing so far indicates that the booster quick disconnect will be located on the launch mount itself. Some expect the booster quick disconnect to therefore hang over the launch mount using the gantry that we're talking about as a support. It's also unclear if the quick disconnect will fall back like the Falcon 9 Strongback, or if there will be two separate quick disconnects like with Falcon 9. This construction is something we'll have to watch carefully to fully understand what SpaceX is building. As always, you can keep up to date by watching Starbase Live, our 24/7 live coverage of the Starship program here in Starbase, Texas. Moving over to the tower, the Chopsticks are fully reeved now. This means the main rope has come up from the spool and been routed through the crown block, down through the traveling block, back up, and then down to the main drawworks winch. And along with that, both chopstick actuators have been installed and have begun being hooked up to the hydraulic system. Once this is completed, SpaceX only needs to install the stabilizer arms, which are currently being built at the Sanchez lot, and then presumably load test the system with some sort of water bag setup like they used on Pad A. All of this could happen in the next couple of weeks, and Tower 2's arms could be operational by the time Flight 8 flies. Another critical component of Pad B that is under construction is the tank farm. We can see here, SpaceX is well underway installing the stands that are used for valve skids and for pumps. This area is for liquid oxygen pumps, while the area behind it is for the liquid methane side of the tank farm. These pumps will be raised like at Massey's, but instead of using concrete, teams are using steel stands, which makes it a little bit more modular. It's hard to tell how many pumps will be installed, but there is likely to be more than Pad A's setup, as SpaceX presumably wants to get their propellant loading times down even further. These pumps come from a German company called, I'll let Adrian say it,
Ruhrpumpen,
which has a couple of facilities in the United States. Now, the pumps that SpaceX bought are the VLT vertical cryogenic process pumps with a max pumping capacity of 7,000 gallons per minute, or 1,600 cubic meters per minute. However, until we know how many pumps SpaceX intends on installing, we won't know the fastest that they'll be able to load, and even then, it's also limited by subcooling capacity and supply line size. Just behind the pumps and subcoolers, we have two liquid methane storage tanks. These will help supplement the storage capacity of the tank farm. The reason why SpaceX doesn't have anything bigger is simple. They just don't have any more room at the launch site to add any more without going into the wetlands, which just opens a whole other can of worms in terms of paperwork. Now let's move to the production site where a lot has happened this week. Let's start off with Ship 32, which was rolled into the high bay to be scrapped on February 7th. The aft section was blowtorched off first and then taken out of the high bay on February 10th. Shortly after, over the course of the week, the ship was destacked from the aft up until the payload section was taken out of the bay. With this ship scrapped, it means there are 0 Block 1 ships left. And no, Ship 20 is not a Block 1 ship. Like I said last week, it's more of a Block 0.5 or 0.75. It's a suborbital hop ship with a full heat shield and Raptor 1.5 vacuum engines, along with many other differences from even Ship 24, which really was the first Block 1 ship. Okay, hold on. Ryan wrote this. Hopefully, we should expect Ship 20 to be scrapped once SpaceX has caught a ship to replace it and show off for visitors. Said ship might be Ship 35 if everything goes perfectly. I disagree with this. I think Ship 20 is cool, and having an example of an early ship prototype around is also cool. Don't scrap Ship 20, SpaceX. They're probably going to scrap Ship 20. We'll see. After Ship 32 was fully destacked and scrapped, the welding robot was taken off of the turntable inside the high bay. With SpaceX now able to stack payload bays and nose cones together in Star Factory, and the rest of the ship work happening inside of Mega Bay 2, high bay's days are surely numbered, as well as Stargate next door, at least until the office building comes fully online. Sooner or later, we expect SpaceX to demolish both and probably get ready to build a Gigabay just like they are at Roberts Road. Oh, you don't know about that? Watch our latest Space Coast update video then. Now, let's move on to Booster 17. That's right, I said Booster 17, the newest booster currently being built in the Mega Bay. Booster 17 just had its liquid oxygen tank finished this week with the rollout of its engine or aft section. As far as we can tell, this booster has no major changes, at least none that are outwardly visible just yet. The real question is if it ends up being the final Block 1 booster to be stacked because, well, I all know we want to see the next version of Super Heavy. Shortly after the liquid oxygen tank was completed, the liquid methane tank was started with the rollout of the 3-ring section below the forward section. And then the forward section was rolled out as well. The stacking process for Block 1 boosters takes around 2 months. Then kitting it out for cryogenic proof testing takes another 4 months or so. So it takes a bit for boosters to be completed, but hopefully SpaceX can speed up the process with Block 2 boosters once those start rolling out. I mean, they cut the construction and preparation time for ships basically in half between Block 1 and Block 2. Speaking of Block 2 of the ship, let's move over to Mega Bay 2, where Ship 36's nose cone and payload bay assembly recently rolled inside and were sleeved over its Pez dispenser. A big thing to note here is that Ship 36 is the first ship to get fully installed catch pins. We can see the opening that was cut in the side of the ship and the pin sticking out. It's unknown how these are attached to the ship's structure, but nonetheless, this is a major milestone to see, and we'll see the same installed on Ship 35, presumably since it also had the cutouts as well. Yes, Ship 33 also had pins, but they were basically just on there to test how they would do during re-entry. They weren't structural or functional. They couldn't have been used for a catch. The next section to roll into Mega Bay 2 will be the forward section, to start the second stacking clock. I say second stacking clock because with Starship Block 2, SpaceX has already started the stacking process by stacking the nose cone and payload bay first. With Ship 33, 34, and 35, this was done inside the high bay, but with Ship 36, it was done inside the Star Factory. After these sections are done stacking, the combined nose cone and payload bay are then rolled into Mega Bay 2 to be sleeved around their Pez dispenser, which is welded to the nose cone and payload bay. Once this is completed, the next section to roll out is the 4-ring forward section as stated a moment ago, otherwise known as the FX4 section. Starting with Ship 35, SpaceX looks to have started the double lift process with the forward section. This lift is started using the 4-point lifter attached to the nose cone and payload bay for a double lift, which is a change from Block 1, where SpaceX used a squid on the nose cone for stacking. The ship turntable in Mega Bay 2 has something special compared to the booster turntables. It has a second robot welder for attaching heat shield tile pins to the section weld seams as they stack the ship. Pretty neat. After the forward section is done getting welded on, the 3-ring common dome section, or CX3, gets stacked. Then comes the first of 2 liquid oxygen tank sections, A23 and A34. After the 2 LOX tank sections are stacked, then comes the transfer tube jig, which helps SpaceX line up the 4 separate transfer tubes for Block 2 of the ship. After that, the aft section, or AX4, which is the engine section of Starship, can be stacked. Now, on Ship 35, from the start of the forward being stacked to the aft getting stacked was about 25 days or so. The longest part so far for ship stacking is the nose cone and payload bay, plus installing of the Pez dispenser. If you include the entire stacking timeline, Block 2 ships take about 7 weeks to stack. Okay, I know that was a lot of information, but it's really neat to see SpaceX stacking these 50 and 70 meter tall vehicles, and it's been a really fun ride watching them learn the best ways of how to complete this process over the past several years. The machine that builds the machine is important, especially if they're going to build enough of these things to get us back to the moon and onto Mars. As for other ships, Ship 35 is on the center stand of Mega Bay 2, getting finished before going to Massey's for cryo, which should be in about 2 months' time or so. Ship 34 is back on a work stand after finishing engine testing, which we'll cover later. Oh boy, will we cover that later. Just you wait. Then, over in Star Factory, we have Ship 37, which has slowed up a bit in getting its tiles done, but crews have much bigger priorities with Ship 34 and Ship 35. Just next to it is Ship 38, which is starting to receive its heat shield tile pins from the pin robot. I don't think we've talked about the office building state of construction for a little while now, but the pass-through is complete and workers are visible walking from one end of the office building through it into the Star Factory. Pretty minor, but over by the X logo on the office building, SpaceX looks to be building a nice little entranceway thing, and while I don't love the wall, the flowers are kind of nice. It's almost like a garden. Dare I say, a rocket garden. Hey, a guy can dream. And last but not least, at the production site, we can see some flap fairing pieces behind the Star Factory. We have aft flap and forward flap pieces here. Okay, so after that info dump, remember the announcement on December 12th, 2024 that a petition had been submitted to incorporate Starbase, Texas as a city? Well, this past week, the petition was approved and the area of Starbase will hold general elections on May 3rd, 2025. If this election passes, then Starbase will become the newest city in Cameron County since 1995. So far, there's only one candidate for mayor, which is Gunnar Milburn, SpaceX's head of security, as well as 2 candidates for commissioners. The boundaries for Starbase are set up in this map here. The boundary line goes from just west of Massey's on Highway 4 to the end of the launch site along this line here. This area incorporates plots of land around the Rocket Ranch outpost and Rio West, as well as stuff to the south of the launch site and to the east of the village. Starbase has grown up from the remote Boca Chica village with literally nothing but sand and a few dozen beach homes to a fully fledged city. Hopefully this means things like road maintenance for Highway 4 and other basic community needs are better met. And hopefully this isn't the beginning of SpaceX going full company town mode and shutting off as much from the public as possible. I should note, however, that so far anyway, even with Starbase as a city, SpaceX could not just close the beach to the public once and for all. It's a question I see come up a lot. That authority remains with Cameron County and remains as it has been, only on a limited basis for testing and vehicle rolls. For now. Speaking of which, after performing a successful 33 engine static fire late last week, Booster 15 rolled back to Mega Bay 1. With this rollback on February 10th, Booster 15 only spent 61 hours outside of the production site. So SpaceX just rolled out a booster, mounted it on the orbital launch mount, then cleaned up the pad, then static fired the booster, lifted it off of the mount, and rolled it back, all in that short a period of time. This is a new record for SpaceX. The previous was Booster 14 in 4 days, but this was less than 3 days. Remarkable. With this test complete, Booster 15 is done with its portion of the single vehicle testing and will now move into final preparations for launch. This entails double checking the vehicle and any final mods that need to be completed, along with the final pieces of assembly, which includes its hot stage ring. Moving now to Booster 15's other half for Starship Flight 8, Ship 34 did a few things this week that we have never seen in the Starship program. To start, Ship 34 rolled out to Massey's on the 10th during the usual middle-of-the-night Massey's rollouts. Once at Massey's, crews did checks, and in the early morning of the 11th, its flaps were deployed. SpaceX does this for static fires so as to not damage the flaps while they're tied down. Then, on the night of the 11th, SpaceX performed a long-duration static fire of Ship 34. Usually, SpaceX fires ships for around 10 seconds, but this was for nearly a minute, and it was during the night. SpaceX hasn't static fired a ship at night since Ship 24 on August 9th, 2022. After this historic static fire, Ship 34 was then rolled back to Mega Bay 2, spending around 72 hours out of the production site, which is also a record testing timeline for SpaceX as they continue to speed up their processes. Now I hear you asking, why a nearly 60-second static fire? Well, SpaceX told us why. Quote, the extended firing tested new hardware and cycled the 6 Raptor engines through multiple thrust levels to recreate different conditions seen within the propulsion system during flight. Data from the test will inform upgrades to the ship's hardware and flight profile ahead of the next launch, close quote. So let's unpack this. First off, SpaceX mentions testing new hardware. This is probably related to the observation that occurred during Flight 7 with Ship 33, where the anomaly caused a rapid unscheduled disassembly of the vehicle. So far, we've had no confirmation from SpaceX on what actually caused the anomaly, but based on a tweet from SpaceX CEO Elon Musk and the fire scene through one of the aft flap actuator holes, it looks like a major leak occurred in the engine bay above the engine shielding, as we've mentioned in the past. So these changes might be related to more hardened transfer tube lines or beefed up propellant lines to the engines inside the engine bay itself. When Ship 34 rolled out, there weren't really any noticeable increases in vents or any sign of a fire suppression system. However, recently 5 high-pressure tanks were added to the Massey static fire stand and routed into the ship quick disconnect. These could be for some kind of suppression system gas, but we just don't really know. The second piece of that first sentence also states that SpaceX tested different thrust levels during the static fire, which you can clearly see based on the amount of light created changing. This was done to test different regimes during flight to verify said new hardware, as well as possibly new software. And finally, this test can help to inform SpaceX on making changes to vehicle hardware and software and its flight profile down the line. Now, the question becomes, was this a one-off test to verify changes due to the anomaly on Ship 33, or is SpaceX going to start doing longer duration static fires with future ships? They don't have to go the full 60 seconds, but even doing 30-second static fires while throttling can give a lot more data than a 10-second static fire could. You know what I always say, more data, more better. Special thanks to Mary and Caesar for covering the static fire. I was traveling back to Starbase and couldn't be here, but from talking to both of them and everyone else who saw the test, I really hope this isn't the one and only long duration static fire that ever happens. We do know that the Massey flame trench was built to take longer duration static fires. SpaceX just hadn't used that capability until now. Although, during the test, it did look like there was some possible slag or melted metal thrown up and out of the trench exit. It's possible that this duration was just at the limit of what the static fire stand can handle, and now they'll have some repairs and other modifications to do. Even if there was some damage though, we know that SpaceX is pretty good at fixing pad damage. I mean, they turned around Pad A in 6 months with a new deluge system after Flight 1 caused what was essentially a small volcanic eruption in the concrete. Either way, the static fire pad is not needed until Ship 35, which has just finished stacking and has not even been cryo-proof tested yet, so they've got some time. After Ship 34 static fired and rolled back to the production site, the stop sign at the ring yard entrance got blown away from the wind and is seen rolling off camera. Shortly after, someone picked it back up and reinstalled it on its pole. Non sequitur, I know, but sometimes you just have to enjoy the little things in life. Now let's talk about Pad A readiness for Flight 8. During this past week, SpaceX tested the Chopsticks with some quick close tests at catch height, probably just verifying some repairs or possible changes in software. Along with that, crews are still hard at work completing the refurbishment work on the pad itself. With Booster 15's static fire out of the way, the final touches can now be made to everything, and eventually they'll repaint the legs and the orbital launch mount deck again. Speaking of Pad A, SpaceX has received the approval for the draft wastewater permit from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is for the discharge of wastewater from the Pad A deluge. There was some miscommunication over what the correct permit SpaceX needed to legally operate their deluge system, but this approval came during the Commissioner's agenda meeting on February 13th, just putting a final nail in that coffin. This is another step in getting the finalized wastewater permit for Pad A. It's unclear exactly what permit SpaceX will need for Pad B's deluge system, but they'll need something. Currently, Massey's water deluge system for the flame trench there operates under the Basic Industrial Wastewater Permit. In other launch site news, SpaceX is putting up a fence out in the flats around their property line to try and keep people off their property. SpaceX has had issues in the past with people trespassing onto their property and with people getting too close to the launch pads themselves. Previously, admittedly, the property markers have been kind of nondescript wooden stakes with purple paint on them, and they often get broken, and it's not uncommon for large stretches of the property line to be somewhat poorly marked. So, this is good. Hey, it could be an actual wall that obstructs sight lines. Nobody wants that. Keeping with the theme of infrastructure improvements at the launch site, SpaceX is also planning to build a roundabout just past the D4 gate at the launch site just before the beach. I love roundabouts. I really do, despite people in the US not knowing how to drive on them. This though, briefly the reason I want to yell about this is because people will still drive through the roundabout and to the beach and do the same traffic clogging dance, just now with a roundabout in the way. It's not like it's at the end of the beach. Sure, it'll help tanker trucks turn around. That's one of the places they basically already do it. But for regular people, and there's so much more I want to say, but let's move on. This next bit of news is really cool, even if it doesn't sound really cool. Recently, SpaceX applied for a new federal communication license with the Federal Communications Commission. This new license asks for authorization to, hey, wake up! It's asking for authorization to use Starlink at altitudes of up to 300 kilometers. Now, in the past, SpaceX had only requested for altitudes of under 250 kilometers. This license would cover from March 2025 to September 2025 and could be possibly related to Flight 9. If this is the case, then this could be our first evidence that SpaceX intends to go to orbit, as this altitude would likely be required for Starlink deployment. But we'll have to wait and see for more information before we know for sure. See? I told you it was cool. Okay, so with both static fires for the Flight 8 vehicles complete, and with both back into their respective bays, the question is, when will Flight 8 launch? Well, that's a hard question to answer. Yes, all of the single vehicle testing is complete, but crews still have a decent amount of work to complete on Ship 34. If SpaceX's post on X that we talked about earlier is any indication, then they have applied a fix for the problem that occurred during Flight 7 and then tested that fix with the long-duration static fire. But SpaceX also says that the test was to inform on changes that still might need to be made, which kind of implies that there are still modifications to be made ahead of this upcoming flight. If this is the case, then crews in Mega Bay 2 still have a decent amount of work ahead of them before rollout for flight. It's unknown exactly what changes need to be made as a whole, or how long they'll take, or if any more changes are even necessary for this flight. The other side of this is, of course, the regulatory side. Now, SpaceX does not need a license modification for Flight 8 as long as they stick to the same trajectory as they planned with Flight 7. The biggest thing will be finishing the mishap investigation and getting the approval to launch Flight 8. This will all most likely finish together sometime in early March, but you never know with SpaceX, and it's not impossible to have February still on the menu. As soon as we know more, you'll know more. So stay tuned to NSF's social media feeds wherever you get your news, and to our live streams and videos here. Well, that'll about cover it for this week at Starbase, Texas, which is crazy to say it might actually be a real city later this year. We'll see you next Monday for another Starbase update. I'm Jack Beyer, and as always, don't forget, be excellent to each other. SpaceX is really good at building rockets, but they seem to be less good at basic infrastructure things. Need I remind you of the Gateway to Mars sign, cutting a hole in the high bay to get Booster 1 out of it, or the suborbital pad parking lot, or the Starship derived vertical tank fire?